Okay, hi guys. It's Jubilee again. We're here for our last TA review, so hopefully you guys are excited about that. We're almost there. And this week we're going to be doing the female reproductive system. So this one is one of my favorites just because it's a little complicated. But if you take the time to study it, it actually makes a lot of sense. Okay, so by the end, you'll know what all these things are, hopefully. Okay, so there is a lot that goes on in the female reproductive system, right? And that's just because it's a little more complicated than the male reproductive system, right? We learned that last week. The male reproductive system is basically to make and transport sperm, right? That's its whole function, make and transport sperm. For the female, it's a little bit more complicated, right? Because the female has to transport the sperm as well. It has to make its own component, the oocyte, the ovum. It has to bring those two together and make sure they come together. And then it has to do this whole thing called, developing a fetus, right? And giving birth and everything like that, right? So it's a little bit more complicated. And then the thing that makes it even more complicated is the fact that after we go through this giant process, life-changing process, and the female creates this fetus, gives birth and everything like that, it has to be repeatable, right? You have to be able to do it all again. So this whole process of making a fetus and everything can't just tear everything up, right? This needs to be a cycle, a cyclic thing that allows for multiple births and multiple pregnancies. And so that is kind of why the female reproductive system is a little more complicated, right? That's why females have cycles. That's why this is a cyclic process, whereas the male is just kind of constantly doing the same thing, right, over and over, because they don't need to cycle. They just need to be ready whenever the female is in the right part of their cycle. So that's kind of the biggest difference, right? So there's a lot of parts that we're going to talk about and we're going to get to. So the first one and kind of the biggest one is going to be the ovaries. And so that's the kind of big organ in the female reproductive system. And so it has two main functions, right? So it's going to produce the female gamete, right? So that's going to be the ovum, the oocyte, as well as the female sex hormone. Sorry, that's my cat in the background. Okay, sorry, I locked him up. I didn't know if you guys could hear him in the background or not, but okay. What was I talking about? Yeah, so the female sex hormones. And so the main one is going to be estrogen. But the other one that a lot of people don't think about is progesterone, and that one is really important too. So those are the two main female sex hormones, and those are produced in the ovaries, okay? And so the way it does this is by cyclically secreting these hormones and periodically releasing these ovum, okay? And that's very important. So we release those oocytes every once in a while, every period. So for females, that's going to be like 30 days or whatever. It varies by species a lot. And then cyclically secreting these hormones. And those hormones are going to orchestrate this whole process. So that's what's really important about the ovaries. Okay. So once those ovaries make the female gamete, the ovum, it gets caught up by this thing called the fallopian tube. And that's just because the ovaries are kind of tucked away in connective tissue here, but the oocyte can ovulate anywhere on this ovary, right? So we need something to catch it depending on whether it ovulates over here or over here or over here, and that's what this fallopian tube does. So it catches the egg wherever it decides to ovulate from. It's like a little catcher's mitt, and then it transports it through this tube, the fallopian tube, to the uterus, okay? And then also, if copulation occurs and there's sperm in here, the sperm will travel all the way up through the fallopian tube, and this is where fertilization happens, okay, in this fallopian tube. So it has to travel all the way up here to meet the oocyte once it's been ovulated, okay? So then they're going to travel together and implant in the uterus, okay? And then the uterus is this really big muscular organ, and that's what's going to become the womb. Okay, so that's where it's going to obviously grow in size and change a lot if pregnancy does occur, but that's what's going to form the womb for the fetus. Okay, and so since it does have to do all of that change and stuff like that and prepare for the implantation of a possible zygote, fertilized ovum, it goes through a lot of change throughout this cycle, right? Throughout this cycle, depending on what's going on with all the other female sex organs. And so what happens is the lining of the uterus is actually going to grow and shed and grow and shed, depending on where it is in the cycle, okay? And that's kind of what creates the menstrual cycle. So it's the constant growing and then shedding of the uterus that's going to create that kind of mucus-like bleeding that occurs during the menstrual cycle, okay? And it's different in different animals, and dogs and cats, they don't have the same kind of periods like humans do. They actually resorb their uterine lining. They resorb it, so it gets absorbed back in here, and they don't have bleeding like humans do. But yeah, so that's the uterus, and then there's the cervix down here. And so the cervix is basically just the barrier between the vagina and the uterus. And the whole point of that, right, is because down here's the vagina, and that is open to the external environment, right? So we can get bacteria in there, we can get dirt and stuff like that in there, and things that we don't want. Whereas the uterus, this is where our fetus is going to grow, you know, for potentially 9 months. And so we do not want bacteria, viruses, anything like that in there, because that's going to cause obviously problems and infections within that very sensitive, immunocompromised fetus. And so that's the whole role of the cervix, is we do not want bacteria in here, but we have to have this connective tube between the vagina and the uterus. So the cervix is this really tight barrier that only allows certain things through, okay? So the whole point is to keep bacteria out and allow sperm in, and that's kind of the goal, right, of the cervix, to do that. So then we have the vagina, and that's where copulation occurs. That's also the birth canal, and again, like I said, that's open to the external environment, right? So it is not sterile. You can't consider this sterile. The uterus, you can consider sterile. It should be sterile, okay? And then you also have the accessory kind of sex organ, and that's going to be the mammary glands, okay? And that's obviously going to produce milk for the offspring, and that's really important as well, and they develop during pregnancy as well, okay? And all of this is orchestrated by hormones, literally all of it, okay? So that's why it's a little more complicated than in the male. In the male, they just have testosterone all the time. In the female, these hormones are constantly changing and affecting other organs and doing this whole feedback loop. And that's just to make sure everybody's on the same page, is in the same stage of this cycle at the same time, okay? So yeah, it's a little complicated. Let's see. Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about the ovaries. And they are a big deal. They're a little complicated. There's a lot going on in them, but we're going to try and make it a little more clear for you guys. So in the ovaries, the big main overall structures are going to be the germinal epithelium. So germinal epithelium is this singular cell layer, right? Simple squamous epithelium on the outside of the ovary, okay? It's basically mesothelium, right? You have mesothelium lining all your organs. The germinal epithelium is just the type of mesothelium around the ovaries, okay? It's called the germinal epithelium because that's where the germ cells come from, right? They rupture out of the side of this ovary. Like I said, it can come from anywhere. So that's why they call it the germinal epithelium, okay? Then you have the tunica albuginea, And just like in the male, the tunica albiginia, it means white coat, right? Tunic is a coat, albino or whatever is white. So it's a white coat of connective tissue. And that's just because if you look at it grossly, meaning if you look at it on a large scale, it'll appear white because it's all this really dense connective tissue, and connective tissue is white. But that's right under the germinal epithelium. That's the tunica albuginea. And that's just the connective tissue right here under the germinal epithelium. The big structure after that is you have the cortex. And just like all your organs, so the cortex is going to be more towards the outside. So this is all the cortex right here, and that's the part with the follicles that we're going to talk so much about. There's a lot of different stages of follicles in an ovary at any given time, and they're all contained within the cortex, this outer portion of the ovary. Okay, and then you have the medulla, which is like the middle part, right? So the medulla is going to be this inner portion of the ovary that's going to have all the blood vessels and the vasculature, right, providing nutrients to all this. So this is all going to be within the medulla right here, all these blood vessels and everything. Okay. And again, the function of the ovaries are to produce ovum periodically and hormones cyclically. Okay, so now we're going to talk about follicular development. I said earlier, you could see there's all these different follicles. Every single one of these is a follicle, and they're all at different stages at any given time in the ovary. So we're going to talk about those different stages of these follicles. And so each one of these follicles contains a potential oocyte. Okay, so one day they could be an oocyte that gets ovulated and eventually tries to get fertilized and stuff like that, right? So every single one of these follicles, that's what they have. And the first one that you start out with is a primordial follicle. Okay, primordial. And to me, that kind of sounds like it's the prime one, it's the origin, so it is the very oldest one. Sounds ancient. Those are the ones that are present at birth, okay? And that's very important for you guys to understand, that they're present at birth. So all of the potential follicles that any female could ever have are present at birth, okay? We don't make new primordial follicles once they're born. Does that make sense? So these are all present at birth, and there's like millions of them. I don't know how many million are present at birth, but there's millions, more than you could ever ovulate, even if you dreamed of it. So those are all present at birth, and you can tell it's a primordial follicle because it's got this really big oocyte right here. Okay, so this whole thing is the oocyte. It's huge. It's one of the biggest cells in your body. It is huge. And then it's got these really thin, flat follicular cells around it. Okay, so it's got like a single layer of thin, flat follicular cells. So that's how you know it's a primordial follicle. Okay, and so what happens is those primordial follicles hang around for most of your life, and they don't do anything, and they wait there until they are called upon to develop. Okay, and this starts to happen after puberty starts, obviously. So they hang around most of your life, then puberty happens, and some of them every cycle get called upon to develop. Okay, we don't know how they get picked. Some of them just randomly get picked, and they're like, okay, this cycle I'm going to start developing. And once they start developing, they form a primary follicle, okay? And so this primary follicle, they're all just going to keep getting bigger and bigger, so it's going to develop this thing called a zona pellucida. So this is a very well-developed primary follicle. It is just starting to become a secondary follicle, but it's still a primary. And so you see this thick ring around the oocyte. So this whole thing in the middle is that big oocyte, and this thick pink ring around it is that zona pellucida. Okay, and that zona pellucida is going to stay with the oocyte through basically its entire development. Okay, and it's just this protective barrier, and it's really important in protecting the oocyte from getting penetrated by more than one sperm or a sperm from a different species. Okay, so it helps protect the oocyte. That's really all you need to know. It protects the oocyte, stays around it, and that starts developing when it starts to become a primary follicle, okay? And then the surrounding follicular cells around it start to become more cuboidal and bubbly, right? You see how here they were really small and flat. Now they're proliferating. There's a lot more of them. And they're also really bubbly, okay? So they become super cuboidal. And these are what we're going to call granulosa cells. Okay, so these are granulosa cells, these follicular cells right here. Okay, it's going to keep developing, keep getting bigger, and then it's going to become what we call a secondary follicle. Okay, and the way you can instantly tell if it's a secondary follicle is that it has an antrum. Okay, if it has an antrum, it is a secondary follicle. So this right here is a secondary follicle, and this antrum is this right here. So it's kind of this little space within the follicle that's filling up with liquid. It's filling up with fluid. Okay, and what that fluid is a bunch of hormones and stuff like that that these granulosa cells are producing. Okay, so as these granulosa cells are being produced, they're making a bunch of estrogen, some progesterone, not very much progesterone, mainly estrogen, and a lot of it is getting stored into this thing called an antrum. Okay, and so the second you have the development of an antrum, it's a secondary follicle. Okay, so you've got more granulosa cells in here, right? So they're going to be producing more and more estrogen. And then these cells around it are called theca cells. And so this is where you start to have a very prominent theca interna and theca externa. Okay, and basically what that means is just all of these cells around it start to become more organized. So you can see how there's these cells right here becoming organized around the follicle, and then there's cells outside of it again becoming organized. It kind of looks like there's two layers out here. So that's our theca interna and theca externa. Okay, so all of these are just around here in the follicle to help create this really big follicle, this really big antrum, and just keep developing. Okay, and then the oocytes here in the middle. Then once it becomes even bigger, we get what's called a tertiary follicle. Okay, tertiary follicles are huge. You can also call them Graafian follicles or mature follicles. Those are all the same name for a tertiary follicle. They all mean the same thing. A tertiary follicle is huge and it is just about to ovulate. Okay, so they are huge. So this is just part of a tertiary follicle because you can't get it all in one caption and still see it with good detail in here. But so this is a tertiary follicle. They are huge and they develop this thing called a corona radiata and a cumulus oophrys. So the corona radiata is just this crown radiating around the oocyte. So here's our oocyte with its zona pellucida around it still. And this crown of radiating cells, right, corona radiata, around the oocyte is what we call a corona radiata, okay? And they're just around the oocyte, protecting it still. And then we have this thing called a cumulus oophrys. This cumulus oophrys is like an anchoring bridge, right? Because this oocyte is projecting into the middle of the follicle, and this cumulus oophrys is anchoring it down to the granulosa cells below it, okay? And that's just because as this follicle becomes ready to ovulate, we want to project this oocyte so it's more in the middle of the follicle so that it can just break off right here. It'll just break off right here and it can be ovulated out of the ovary. Okay, and then we've got this huge antrum full of fluid. Okay, so that's that. And now we're going to practice identifying some. Okay, so just take a minute before I say it. Try and tell me what this is, what this is, what this is. So hopefully you know that all of these are primordial follicles. Okay, these are all good examples of primordial follicles. So these are the ones that are present at birth, and pretty much all they consist of is the oocyte, the giant oocyte, and really thin, flat follicular cells. Okay, really thin, flat follicular cells. Okay, try and identify this before I say it. This one. All of these. So all of these are primary follicles, primary follicles. So that's the one, once they get called upon to start growing randomly, they say, okay, this cycle I'm gonna grow and try and get big. This is a primary follicle. And the reason you can't see the oocyte, right, is just because it's like we're trying to cut an egg, right? So if I cut an egg and I don't cut it through the center, you can't see the yolk, right? And so in these, we didn't cut it right through the center, so you can't see the little oocyte in the middle, but you can see there are all of these follicular cells everywhere, right? There's a lot of follicular cells. They're starting to get bigger and bigger. The follicle as a whole is getting bigger and bigger, but we don't have an antrum yet, right? We don't have an antrum yet, so it's not a secondary follicle. So it's a primary follicle still, okay? And then this one right here, try and tell me what this one would be. Hopefully you can guess just because I'm going chronologically. This is a secondary follicle, right? And the way I know that is it has an antrum, right? This is an antrum right here. So I automatically know it's a secondary follicle because it's starting to have this antrum, okay? And again, we didn't cut this one right through the center, so we can't see the oocyte in here, but I promise it's in here. So this is an antrum, and then we've got those granulosa cells, and we're starting to get that theca interna and theca externa, okay, around this secondary follicle. And then this one right here, hopefully you can tell this is a tertiary follicle. This is a mature follicle. Okay, if you could see the whole ovary, this would be taking up a vast majority of the whole ovary. It is huge, right? You can't even see individual cells at this level of magnification because it is huge. So this is a mature follicle. This whole thing is the antrum. And again, we didn't cut this one right in the middle, so you can't see where the oocyte would be. So you can't see that corona radiata and cumulus oophrys that would be here. And that's, again, just because it's really hard to cut these really big follicles right through the center, okay? But this is a tertiary follicle. It is huge. Okay, so we talked about all the follicles in the ovaries. Here, let me just explain something real quick about these follicles. So we said all of them start out as primordial follicles, right? And you've got millions of them. And then every cycle, some of them get called upon to develop, right? Not all of them, because then you would only have one cycle in your entire life. Only a couple of them, or maybe 10 of them, start to develop, right? But only one gets to ovulate, okay? So only one gets to ovulate. And so what happens is as these follicles start developing, what they're doing is competing with each other, okay? They're competing with each other to try to they're trying to get the biggest, the fastest. And as they do that, these cells are producing hormones that inhibit other follicles, okay? So what they're doing is just trying to get bigger. So this one's bigger than this one, and so it's producing more hormones to try to negate this one and try and make this one die off, okay? And so they're all competing and competing and competing, and as they get bigger and bigger and bigger, more of them start losing the competition and die off, okay? And eventually it gets to where you only have one huge one, and this one huge one is creating so much of that inhibitory hormone, you don't need to know what it is, that all the other follicles have died off, and this is the one big mature follicle that is left and that is ready to ovulate, okay? All the other ones that have started to develop, lost. You've still got primordial follicles and stuff like that, but in this ovulation cycle, only this one big one is going to ovulate, okay? Only one happens per cycle, unless you have like twins or something like that, but those are normally, that doesn't normally happen. Or unless you're like a breed, I don't know what I'm saying, unless you're like a litter kind of animal, you know what I mean? So for dogs and cats and stuff like that, they have multiple follicles that are competing with each other, and even then only the biggest ones, the ones that grow the fastest, ovulate. Hopefully I didn't confuse y'all with that. I just have too much veterinary knowledge and I always want to show it, share it, but I don't know, maybe I'm confusing y'all. Anyways, so if you are that one special huge follicle, or in the case of dogs or cats and stuff like that, one of those like 6 or 9 special huge follicles, Then what happens is you get called upon, you're super special, you get called upon to ovulate. Okay, so only those special huge follicles that won the race ovulate. And what ovulation is it is the release of that oocyte, right? We said it ovulates from wherever it develops out of the side of the ovary. Okay, so it actually breaks the epithelium of the ovary, so it creates a little rupture and squirts out with all of the hormones and everything, fluid that's being made in this follicle. Okay, and here you can see there's that little oocyte, and it's still got its zona pellucida around it, and it's still got some granulosa cells around it too, but yeah. So it's ovulated out into the wild. Hopefully it'll get picked up later, but we'll talk about that later. So this is ovulation, okay? And then what happens is the ovary has to heal itself back up, okay? So that forms the corpus hemorrhagium, okay? So because we're breaking this, right, we're literally breaking and rupturing this lining of the ovaries, there's this brief period of bleeding, okay, and that's called the corpus hemorrhagium. Hemorrhage meaning bleeding, right? Corpus hemorrhagium. So there's this brief site of bleeding, and that's going to heal up on itself and form the corpus hemorrhagium, okay? Then what's going to happen is as it's healing up and everything, it's going to form this thing called the corpus luteum, okay? And this corpus luteum is going to change. These cells in here are all going to change and form this giant corpus luteum after that follicle ovulated. And the whole point of this corpus luteum is it's trying to maintain a pregnancy, okay? Because we just ovulated an oocyte, right? So that corpus luteum is saying, oh my gosh, we just ovulated an oocyte. I really hope this oocyte gets fertilized. We need to get ready for a pregnancy if we get one, right? If that oocyte gets fertilized, we need to make sure that we're producing hormones that are going to get everything ready, okay? So this corpus luteum is going to close up form, and it's going to focus really hard on producing a ton of progesterone, okay? It also produces estrogen as well, but the main thing is progesterone, and progesterone is the big pregnancy hormone, okay? So it helps to maintain pregnancy, and so this female may not be pregnant yet, but we want to get started on producing that progesterone so we can make all of those changes that are needed to make a viable pregnancy, okay? So that's really important, those hormones working in there. And then after this corpus luteum regresses, so either after the pregnancy is done, or if we don't get pregnant and it realizes, oh, dang it, we didn't get fertilized this time, we're not pregnant, so there's no point in me staying like this, then the corpus luteum is going to regress and form a corpus albicans. Okay, corpus albicans, again, like albino, so it's this white scar tissue. Okay, so it just forms this scar tissue. But yeah, fun fact. Yeah, I guess I'll tell you the fun fact. Fun fact, no, I'll tell you later. I'm sorry, guys. Okay, so now we're going to talk more about the corpus luteum. So again, the corpus luteum is designed to help maintain pregnancy. It really, really hopes that you're going to get pregnant every single time that a follicle ovulates. Okay, so every time a follicle ovulates, it forms a corpus luteum, whether you are pregnant or not. It's hoping you will. And so the reason it's called the corpus luteum is because we'll learn in a second when we go over the hormones that luteinizing hormone is what causes ovulation. Okay, so whenever a follicle ovulates, you have really high levels of luteinizing hormone, and this luteinizing hormone is going to affect the ovulated follicle and turn it into the corpus luteum, right? Luteinizing hormone, corpus luteum, that's why it's called that. So it's going to cause a change in these cells. These cells are going to swell up, and these granulosa cells that we talked about are going to become granulosa lutein cells, and the theca interna is going to become theca lutein cells. So here you can see these are the granulosa lutein cells, and these are the theca lutein cells, okay, of that big, huge corpus luteum. You see how it takes up most of the ovary, right? That's the whole ovary right there. It's most of it. Granulosa lutein, theca lutein cells, right, of the corpus luteum, big giant corpus luteum. And again, these cells swell up and they're focusing really hard on producing estrogen and a ton of progesterone. And again, their hope is that this animal or whatever will get pregnant. So they're trying to get everything ready for a possible pregnancy. Okay, and so again, we said if pregnancy does not occur, that corpus luteum isn't needed anymore. So this is that big corpus luteum. What's going to happen is if it realizes, oh, dang it, we're not pregnant, it's going to start to regress and form this scar tissue. So you see this big white thing, that's the corpus albicans. Albicans like albino. So it's big and white and it's scar tissue. And it'll just get smaller and smaller and smaller over time. See how this one's smaller? It's older than this one. They'll get even smaller and they just form these little scar tissue things in the ovaries. Okay, that's the corpus albicans. Okay, and so remember I said not every follicle gets ovulated. Okay, so all that we were just talking about with this corpus albicans, this corpus luteum, that only happens in the special chosen follicle that grew the fastest, the biggest, that ovulated, right? And we said a lot of these follicles lose the race pretty early on, pretty quickly, right? They don't get ovulated. They're not the lucky big fast grower. And so what happens when they are not ovulated is atresia. Atresia. So this is the death of a follicle. And I know that confuses some people because when they hear something like death, they're like, oh my gosh, atresia must be a bad thing. It's the dying of a follicle, so it must not be supposed to happen. But remember we said this is normal. This happens every cycle to all of the follicles that don't get big enough fast enough. Okay, so it's normal, it's not sad, and it's just because there are multiple follicles competing at one time, and the ones that lose die off. Okay, it's just survival of the fittest. And so what happens is they undergo atresia, so you can see these cells, the granulosa cells, are kind of collapsing down and going towards the center, right? That doesn't happen in those big mature follicles. These are ones that are dying off. So they're undergoing atresia, it's collapsing down, and they form these white things called glassy membranes. Glassy membranes. So this is a different type of scar tissue that occurs, and it occurs due to atresia. Okay, so it is not the same as a corpus albicans. If I see a corpus albicans, I know that that came from an ovulated follicle, right? If I see a glassy membrane, I know that that came from a follicle that underwent atresia. Okay, so just keep those separate, and don't be sad for these follicles. They're okay. Okay, so we're done talking about the ovary and stuff like that for now. Now we're going to talk about how it goes through the rest of the reproductive tract once that little ovum is ovulated. Okay, so we said that they can ovulate from any side of the ovary, right? We don't know where it's going to happen, so we need this big catcher's mitt to catch that oocyte, that ovum. Okay, and that's a job of the fallopian tubes. And so it has different parts to it. So the catcher's mitt part is called the infundibular portion, or the infundibulum. Okay, so this is the infundibulum, this is the infundibulum. They're just these big catcher's mitts. And so they kind of reach out like a bunch of fingers and try and grab this oocyte from wherever it ovulates from. Okay, so it has long finger-like projections, and what those are called is fimbriae. Okay, so these are all little fimbriae in here, and they are ready to catch the follicle, and they're ciliated, simple columnar cells, and they're just kind of moving around all around the ovary trying to catch this oocyte as soon as it ovulates. Okay, then once that happens, those cilia are going to move it in towards the rest of the fallopian tube, and it goes through this part called the ampulla. So that's that early part after the infundibulum, and that has So that's where it starts to contain it and wrap it in that connective tissue. Okay, it also has secretory, simple columnar ciliated cells, and smooth muscle to help kind of move things along. Okay, then it goes through the isthmus and the interstitial segment, and it just keeps narrowing down, and eventually it's going to go into the uterus. Right, and we said that fertilization occurs in the fallopian tube. So the sperm have to go all the way in this uterine tube to meet up with that ovum that just got ovulated. And that's where fertilization occurs. And as this zygote travels down here, it starts to develop and get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then by the time it gets into the uterus, it's ready to implant. Okay, that little zygote has divided enough and now it's ready to implant as a fetus. Okay, so here are some images of this. So this is the infundibulum, and you can see how there are all these finger-like projections, right? It looks like a bunch of little fingers sticking out, ready to grab something. Okay, and you can see when you zoom in, it's simple columnar epithelium, and there's all these cilia, okay, ready to catch a little oocyte. So if it gets on there, it can move it in towards the ampulla. So this is the ampulla. It looks a lot like this, but now it's enclosed in connective tissue. Right now it's in a tube. It's actually captured. And here you can see more of that epithelium as we go further inward. Okay, so that was the uterine tube. Remember, once we get through the fallopian tube, we get to the uterus. And this is the womb, right? So this is that thing that's constantly growing and regressing and growing and regressing, hoping for implantation to occur. And it's confusing too because it goes through a lot of changes, okay? So it has two main parts, okay, in this inner lining of the uterus. Okay, so this is the endometrium. So this is the innermost part of the uterus. This would be the inside of the uterus. This is the outermost part of the uterus. This would be the outside of the uterus. So this is the endometrium, and that's going to contain spiraling arteries and secretory glands. Okay, so it's very vascular. There's lots of arteries in here, and there are tons of secretory glands. Okay, all of these giant big holes are secretory glands developing in here, trying to create a good environment for the fetus in here because they're hoping implantation is going to occur. Okay, and so within this endometrium, there's two main layers to it. So it's called the stratum basal, and that's kind of this part that stays pretty much the same. This is the stratum basal, and this is the stratum functionalis. Okay, stratum functionalis. And so this is going to be the part that grows and regresses and grows and regresses throughout the female cycle. Okay, the stratum basal is always going to stay there, and it provides the base for that stratum functionalis to grow out. Okay, and then under the endometrium we have myometrium, and so you can guess there's going to be a lot of muscle in the myometrium. So there's a lot of smooth muscle in here, right? And that's because the uterus is a really strong organ. Uterine contractions are a big deal, right? Because they have to push out an entire fetus. So there's a lot of smooth muscle in here. It's very thick. And then on the very outside, we have the epimetrium. So that's that mesothelium lining. It's one cell thick, right? We have mesothelium outside of every organ. So that's our epimetrium outside of the uterus. Okay, so changes in the uterine lining. So it's like about a 28-day cycle for humans. And so we said this grows and regresses and grows and regresses. So in the menstrual phase, that's where there is bleeding and shedding of this uterine lining. Okay, so all of the zona functionalis gets shed and is sloughed off and gotten rid of. So that's the menstrual phase. So that's right here where everything's fallen off. And then it starts to regrow, right? So that's the early proliferative phase. So right here, we're just starting to regrow. There's not much going on yet. Then we have the late proliferative phase. So that's right here. We're starting to have things. You can see those big secretory glands forming. If you zoomed in more, you could see some spiral arteries. Late proliferative phase is going to be right here, right? We have a bunch of secretory glands and spiraling arteries. That's where we're rapidly growing, trying to get ready for an implantation. And then we have, late proliferative. And then we have early and late secretory phases. So that's towards the very end. And that's when we are just getting really ready. It's huge. Those spiraling arteries are really tortuous. Those secretory glands are huge, creating a lot of stuff. And then if implantation occurs, great, now we're pregnant. If it does not, this is where ischemia occurs. So that's not getting enough blood supply, and then necrosis and menstruation occurs. So we start all again, right? We start all over. And that's the whole cycle, right? So now we're going to talk about the cervix. So we said the cervix is the barrier between the uterus and the vagina. So it's this canal in between the two. It keeps the uterus sterile and the vagina out here open to the external environment, right? So the cervix is that barrier trying to keep this contaminated place away from this sterile place, okay? And so you've got different parts to it. So the endocervix is where we have, it's within the cervical canal, and that's where we have secretory ciliated cells, and they're producing things to create a favorable environment, right? So they're trying to make everything sterile in here. So we're trying to create a favorable environment for the uterus, make everything sterile, okay? The external cervical os is basically just this opening of the cervix, okay? So that's this right here. This whole thing is the cervical os. So that's the opening from the vagina to the endocervix. And then the ectocervix is this kind of junction where we have a change in the epithelium, right? So the vagina, we're going to see in a second, has stratified squamous epithelium because we expect there to be friction out here. The endocervix does not, because we should not have friction in the cervix or in the uterus as well. So we change the epithelium, and that's not a normal thing for epithelium to do, is to just change randomly. So that has a special name. It's called the ectocervix. And FYI, this is just a common place for cancer to occur because, again, epithelium is not used to just being one thing right here and then another thing right here. So here we have simple columnar, and here we have stratified squamous. Okay, so this is the vagina. Here you go. It looks like a lot of other non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, right? So it's non-keratinized because we have nuclei at the top. It's stratified squamous because they're flat. There's lots of layers, and we expect there to be friction here, right? So that's why we need multiple layers of epithelium. Again, this is the birth canal. This is where copulation occurs. Okay, so now the mammary glands. Again, these are important for nourishment and protection, so we can have sustenance for the offspring whenever they want it. We don't have to go hunt something down for them. And this is also where the infant can get a lot of really important antibodies. And this is way more important for things like horses and cows. If they do not get these antibodies, they're pretty much going to die. If humans don't get those antibodies, they're fine. That's why we can do formula feeding. For horses and cows, it's a big deal. Okay, so now we're going to talk about hormones. So I said these are really important, right? And this is a really important diagram. I encourage you guys to look at it, try to understand it, because this is just talking about all the different hormones that are going on in the female cycle to make everything synchronized, okay? So we have hormones from the pituitary that are controlling the female sex organs. So from the pituitary, we have FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, right? We already kind of learned a little bit about that. And what it does is it stimulates the follicles, right? So it's going to call upon some of those follicles and say, hey, you need to start growing, right? We said that some follicles start to grow and are called upon to grow and develop into bigger follicles in the female cycle. So that's what that FSH is going to do. Okay, as these follicles start to grow and get bigger, they're going to produce more and more estrogen, right? So that's being produced from the ovaries, estrogen. Okay, that estrogen is going to affect the uterus, until hey, start getting prepared because we're about to get a really big follicle soon. So start growing, so everything's in sync, right? And that estrogen is also going to feed back into the pituitary and tell you, hey, we have some pretty big follicles down over here in the ovaries. We are working hard down here. We've got some big follicles. So just wanted to let you know that. Okay, and then what the pituitary is going to do is it's going to see that. It's going to say, okay, we've got some big follicles. They're probably ready to ovulate now. And so what it does is it feeds back with estrogen, and the more estrogen it gets, the closer it knows it is to ovulation time, to being ready to ovulate. And so what it does is it saves up luteinizing hormone. And once that estrogen gets high enough, it releases a giant surge of luteinizing hormone. And remember earlier we said luteinizing hormone is important for telling that follicle when to ovulate. So when that follicle gets a surge in luteinizing hormone, it's going to ovulate. And then it's going to form that really important thing called the corpus luteum, right? So here's the corpus hemorrhagium, it's healing. It gets changed by luteinizing hormone, and we get that corpus luteum, right? And we said that corpus luteum is changing, it's getting huge, and what it's trying to do is keep a pregnancy. So that corpus luteum is now going to start producing estrogen still and a ton of progesterone, because that's our pregnancy hormone, right? So it's going to have impact on the uterus to help it maintain that pregnancy. Okay, and so as long as this corpus luteum is here, this uterus is going to try and maintain a pregnancy. Okay, and so then if we get feedback and we say, oh my gosh, there's no baby here, that corpus luteum is going to degenerate because it's not needed anymore. And that's going to tell the uterus, hey, we don't have progesterone anymore. So then it's going to start necrosing and dying off, and that's where we get menstruation and we start all over again. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Just keep looking at the diagram, keep trying. These pictures are also really helpful. I encourage you to look at them. They are great diagrams. But now we're going to really quickly talk about oogenesis. I know I'm taking a little bit of time to do this, I'm sorry. So oogenesis is the formation of those oocytes, right, of ovum. And so it's a little more complicated than in the male. In the male, we just have straight up meiosis, right? We start out with one germ cell and we end up with 4 once we're done, right? In oogenesis, it's more important that we come out with one really quality ovum than making a ton of them, right? Because we only ovulate 1 per month, so we don't need a ton of spermatozoa like in the male. So instead, what happens is for every cycle of meiosis, this one oocyte only makes 1 ovum. Okay, and so what happens is every time it divides, what happens is one of the cells steals all of the cytoplasm of the other one. Okay, does that make sense? So it's going to steal all the cytoplasm, so it's huge. It still has half of the nucleic material, and then that other one that got divided gets pushed off to the side. It has no cytoplasm, so it dies, and that forms what's called a polar body. Okay, so it steals all the cytoplasm, so it ends up being one really huge cell. And that's because as soon as the sperm gets there, the sperm is just a packet of nucleic acid, right? So as soon as that sperm gets there, that zygote needs to start dividing, that embryo needs to start dividing. So it needs all that machinery, all that cytoplasm, mitochondria, everything in there to start making a fetus as soon as possible. So it needs all that cytoplasm. So what happens is, remember, we said all of those primordial follicles are present at birth. Okay, so they've already started meiosis. Okay, so they start meiosis, and then at birth, they stop at a primordial follicle, and they stay like that. So they're not finished with meiosis yet. Okay, and then they stay like that for most for a really long time. Puberty happens, and then if that follicle is the special one that gets called upon to develop, it starts continuing meiosis. Continues meiosis, and then it stops. Okay, it stops, and then it gets ovulated and everything like that. And again, it waits until it is activated by the sperm. Okay, so it does not finish meiosis until that sperm enters it. And so then it goes directly to a zygote, to an embryo. Okay, so does that make sense? I know it's complicated, but there are 2 stages of meiotic arrest. Okay, so it stops at birth and it stops once it's ovulated. And that's to wait for it to be called upon to develop into a mature follicle and to wait for that sperm to fertilize it. Okay, and so because all of those primordial follicles are present at birth, there is no blood ovarian barrier, right? Like in the blood testis barrier. That was really important. That was really important because we're constantly making new cells that the body doesn't recognize. But these have been here that person's entire life. So they're not foreign, so we don't need a blood barrier to protect them. Okay, and that's why it's so important that y'all know primordial follicles are present at birth. Okay. So now we're talking about that last part where once the sperm, the spermatozoa, reaches the oocyte, it forms what's called a zygote, right? And remember when we were learning about the spermatozoa, they have this little acrosome on the very tip. It's this little capsule with a bunch of special enzymes, and it breaks through the zona pellucida. Remember we learned about the zona pellucida? It stays with that ovum its entire life, okay? So it penetrates the zona pellucida. It's got special little enzymes, and it goes, the ovum will accept it. It finishes meiosis, and now it's a zygote, okay? Here's a little polar body off there. But yeah, so now it's fertilized. Okay, quickly about the placenta. The placenta forms and allows for gas, nutrient, and waste exchange for the baby, right? Because they can't eat for themselves, they can't breathe for themselves, so they get all of that from the mother. And again, we can't have the mother's blood come in contact with the baby's blood because they might not have the same blood type, right? They're also just not the same genetically. So if the mother comes in contact with the fetus's blood and the fetus's blood comes in contact, they're going to fight each other because they're not used to each other. And I can tell you right now, the one that's going to win is the mother. So she's going to kill her own baby, right? Because she recognizes it as a foreign body. So we don't want that to happen. That's why we have this special thing called the placenta. And so it allows for the mother's blood to bathe the fetus's blood so they can exchange nutrients, gas, and waste, right? But it also protects the fetus from being attacked by this mother's blood, okay? And then you have this umbilical cord, and that's what the blood goes through from the placenta to get into the baby, right, through their little belly button. And so it's got arteries, veins, and it has this really special kind of connective tissue. It's mucus connective tissue, and what that does is it allows for flexibility, right, because that thing's going to be bending everywhere, but also durability because we don't want to get kinks in this umbilical cord, right? Like you kink a hose. We do not want kinks because that's just going to cut off all the blood circulation and the baby's going to die and we'll be sad, okay? Yeah, so I'm going to go over this practice really quick. So which of these structures corresponds to the images? So A, that is a corpus luteum. You can see it's a huge corpus luteum trying to form. That's going to produce progesterone and estrogen. So yes, that one does match. B, polar body. So no, this is not a polar body. This is actually a secondary follicle trying to form. Remember we said polar bodies are what are formed in the oocyte. In the oocyte as it's stealing all the cytoplasm and pushing the other nucleic material off to the side. So it wouldn't be this whole thing. It would be tiny, tiny within here, polar body. C, cortical blood vessels. So no, these are in the medulla, right? So these are medullary blood vessels, not cortical. Cortex is out here. Okay, so our only matching one would be corpus luteum. This one, which of the structures do not correspond to the image? So which one does not match? A, germinal epithelium. So that one does match. This is that single cell layer of epithelium, mesothelium around the ovary. So that does match. That's A does match. B, primary follicles. So no, this is actually a primordial follicle, right? It's only got that one cell of really flat follicular cells. That's a primordial follicle. So that one does not match. C, primary follicle. Yes, this one does match. You can see that those follicular cells around it are starting to get bubbly and big and thick, right? And they're starting to divide. They're not flat like these cells are right here. Okay, so the only one that doesn't match is B. Okay, this one is talking about the hormones. So which hormones or region of the endometrium matches? So A, FSH. So yes, this is what FSH does, right? It's produced from the pituitary gland and it goes and affects the follicles and stimulates them to develop. So that is follicle stimulating hormone. B, estrogen. So yes, this is estrogen, right? It's being produced by these follicles and it goes to impact the endometrium of the uterus and tell it, hey, we need to start growing and dividing, okay? C, the stratum functionalis. So this is talking about that higher layer, that innermost layer of the uterus that's constantly growing and regressing and growing and regressing. So yes, that is the stratum functionalis. Down here would be the stratum basale, right? The layer that's always there. Okay, so they all match. Okay, so that was it. I'm sorry I went a little long. There's just a lot in the female reproductive system, but hopefully this was helpful. And congrats on getting to your last quiz. Good luck.